Hi, I'm Karen and I'm back again with a practice called diagonal arch and curl. So similar to arch and flatten where we're bringing the spine into flexion and extension. Diagonal arch and curl is focused on bringing the spine into slight rotation as well as some flexion and extension. So we target we focus on the four corners of the torso, which are the shoulders and the hips, and then we do a cross diagonal pattern with those. So come down onto your back, have enough room at the end of your mat and that you can extend your legs out. And then just once you find yourself down on your mat, just taking a moment here to just check in with those four corners of the torso. So notice the sensation of your shoulder blades or the way that your shoulders come into contact with the floor. And then bringing attention to the way that your pelvis comes into contact with the floor as well. So just noticing any differences between the right and the left sides of either the shoulders or the pelvis. And if it feels comfortable for you to do so, take this exploration to legs extended on the mat. And maybe taking that time to notice the weight of each of the legs into the floor. Notice if there's any differences between the right or the left side. And then again, come back to finding your knees in a bent position. And then we're going to just start with the right shoulder. So I'm going to have you just take your right shoulder and letting the shoulder be lifted away from the floor. This might be a very small movement for you. And then we slowly, what we want to pay attention to is there's a contraction in the front of the chest. And then we slowly let that contraction release, letting the shoulder settle just back to the neutral position. And then practice that one more time, bringing that shoulder towards the chest. And then slowly letting it go. What you can imagine is also this shoulder coming towards the center point, just below the rib cage in the center of the body. And imagine this diagonal line to that center point. And then slowly letting that shoulder come back towards the floor. Just letting it rest. And then take the diagonal line and continue it down towards your left side of your pelvis or your left hip crease. And then we start to curl the left hip crease away from the floor in the direction of that center point and the right shoulder. So you might feel that the right side of your pelvis presses a little more firmly into the floor. And then we'll slowly let that movement release. And practice that maybe one or two more times. So we pull that left hip crease towards that center point, and you might notice it's very small, and then we slowly let it go. You might notice that you try to leverage with your foot. Sometimes that's okay to help us learn that movement, but eventually we want the muscles in the torso to be creating that movement of peeling that left side of the pelvis slightly away from the floor. And then we slowly let that release. And then we're going to connect those two movements. So pull your right shoulder towards your left hip crease and your left hip crease towards your right shoulder. Sense and feel that contraction across the torso, and then slowly let them settle back to neutral. And take that maybe one or two more times, just paying attention to that diagonal line across the front of the body. And slowly letting go. And then completing it one more time. And then we go in the opposite direction. So let's just break the movement down. We're going to play with that right shoulder. And we start to pull the right shoulder towards the floor, firmly pressing that shoulder blade into the mat, and then slowly letting it release. As you firmly press that shoulder into the mat, you might notice there's some contraction on the back of the body, and then we slowly let it release. And then think about that left hip crease now moving towards the floor. You might sense your left sit bone presses more firmly into the floor. And then we let it go. So there's some movement of the pelvis, a little bit of a arch, but it moves a little bit. You're tilted off to the left. And then slowly letting it release. And then taking those two and putting them together again. So we press that right shoulder towards the floor and the left hip crease towards the floor. You'll likely feel a diagonal arch across your back from the right shoulder towards that left hip, and then slowly letting it release. And then try that maybe 1 or 2 more times. And you might notice that when you move into that diagonal arch, your head will likely turn towards that right hand. If it doesn't, that's okay. And then complete it 1 more time. And slowly letting it go. So you'll notice there's not a lot of movement of the trunk for me. I'm just moving in a nice comfortable range of motion. So your range might be smaller, it might be larger. Now we're going to tie in the extremities here. So I'm going to have you take your right hand and place it behind your head. If it's not comfortable to do that with your shoulder, then just go back to the first version. And we'll bring in the left knee towards the belly. And just holding that knee there, we're going to start to take the right elbow towards the sky. And then start to pull that right shoulder away from the floor, letting the head be cradled in the arm. You start to pull the torso up, or the head away from the floor, and draw your left knee towards your elbow. It may come close, it may not. And then slowly let that come back down. Bringing the left foot to the floor and the elbow back into neutral. Take your left leg and extend it down towards the end of the mat. And then flex your ankle. Take your left sit bone towards the mat and your right shoulder blade and your right elbow, pressing them into the mat. And then we slowly let that release. Finding neutral. Take your right elbow towards the sky. Head's going to follow towards the left a little bit. And then you activate your ribs, your obliques, pulling the head away from the floor. And then you bring your left knee in towards your belly. Think about that hip following along. So knee and elbow move towards each other. And then we slowly let that release. Coming back to neutral. And then lengthen that left leg down towards the end of the mat. Again, flexing the ankle, elbow, shoulder, left sit bone, and your ankle are flexed and pressing into the mat. Releasing along the back line. And then elbow comes towards the sky, head slightly turns towards the right. Think about using your oblique muscles in the center of your body to pull that shoulder away from the floor. And then your left knee comes in. And then slowly releasing and letting yourself come back to neutral. And taking a moment just in this neutral position between sides, sensing and feeling, noticing what those 4 points of contact on the 4 corners feels like. And then we'll go to our left shoulder towards the right hip. So I also like to sometimes place my hands on the body parts that are going to be moving here, or that I'm intending to move. So we'll just take that left shoulder, pulling it towards the chest or towards that central point on that diagonal line towards the right hip. And then we slowly let that release. And then that left shoulder pulls away from the floor. Keep that left shoulder away from the floor and try to bring your right hip crease on that diagonal towards the center of the body, towards your left shoulder. And then we slowly let that line release on the front of the body. And practicing one more time. Left shoulder and right hip crease towards each other. And you might be noticing that your breath coordinates with the movement a little bit. So generally when we go towards the diagonal curl, which is the front of the body contracting, usually that will tend to happen on an exhale. And then your release will happen on your inhale. And then your inhale might now take your left shoulder towards the mat and your right sit bone towards the mat. And again, you might notice your head turns slightly towards the left, and then slowly letting that release. And taking it through one more time, right sit bone and left shoulder towards the mat. And then take it back and forth one time. So go towards the diagonal curl, towards the front of the body. Shoulder and hip pull away from the floor. Releasing. And maybe taking that little pause in the center. And then going in the opposite direction. Left shoulder, right hip, right sit bone pressed towards the floor. And slowly letting it release. Tying in the periphery, we take the left hand behind the head. And again, the right leg can extend down towards the end of the mat. Taking your left elbow, your shoulder presses towards the floor. You might notice your head slightly turns to the left. Your right sit bone presses towards the mat. And you can flex that right ankle. And then we slowly release. Find your neutral. The left elbow comes away from the floor, connecting into the shoulder, connecting into the obliques to curl that left shoulder away from the floor. Bring your right knee in, and then your knee and your elbow move towards each other. Slowly letting that release. Unwinding that contraction on the front of the body, settling into neutral. Extend the right leg down towards the end of the mat. Flex the ankle, right sit bone, left shoulder and elbow pressed towards the mat. Feel that contraction on the back of the body. Slowly letting it release. Left elbow towards the sky, connecting into the shoulder. The rib cage starts to pull away from the floor, bringing your right knee in, elbow and knee towards each other. Slowly release, bringing the foot to the floor, and the elbow comes to the mat. Take the head or the hand out from behind your head, and take a moment again and just pause here in the center. Maybe take the legs long if it serves you well. And again, take a moment just to check in, noticing how your body's now responding to the floor, those four corners. Is there differences in the weight of the legs into the mat? And that completes our practice of diagonal arch and curl.